He tested the line with the tip of a finger. The ink took to the skin as if it recognized that small habitual muscle. A thin, nearly black smear that he wiped away with the heel of his hand before the stain could set. Light came in low and honeyed through the front window, catching the dust like a slow, private constellations, and the shop held its breath between 1 hour and the next. The bench was as worn as any memory. Gouges scored the wood where a straight edge had slid too often. A crescent darkened where fingers always found the same place. On the bench sat the ink pot, a small chipped ceramic cup whose glaze had once been a clearer blue and was now a map of crazed lines and repairs. It was the object's first name in that shop. Everything else followed. Around it, maps lay folded and unfolded, some trimmed for trade, others kept for reasons that had nothing to do with commerce. Margins annotated in a shorthand of arrows and dates, folds pressed with the certainty of a hand that folded the same way every time. He moved through his morning like a mapmaker's proof, weight and measure, habit and care. He dampened a rag, ran the cloth along the brass nib of a pen. He felt the paper grain, held it up to the light to see how the fibers ran. He mended a seam with a strip of linen and glue so thin it might as well have been thought. There was a companionable repetition to it all. The kettle placed on the range at the same moment the apprentice should have come in. A cup left on the bench at the same peg. The stool across from the mapmaker's own had been empty for longer than it ought to be. Its seat bore the outline of a body in time's faint abrasion, and the mapmaker, when he moved past, would find his fingers pausing on that curve as if to reassure himself that the wood remembered. Customers came as they had always come. The young woman from the harbor with a question about the shoal by Blackhead. An old farmer asking whether a river's bend had shifted since his father's notes. A schoolteacher who wanted a copy for her class. Each left with some piece, sometimes a parcel neatly rolled and tied with twine, sometimes a scrap with a line indicated in a margin. The mapmaker did not tell stories about himself. He offered instead the map's quiet testimony, a line that would not lie about where the sea had gouged the shore, a tiny compass rose penciled in to point out a safe approach. These were small mercies, and the town took them as one takes the weather. Necessary, ordinary, reliable. The apprentice's absence had begun as a hollow of habit. He was not gone by headline or announcement. There was simply a morning when the stool was empty and the whistle he once carried. An off-key little melody he liked to whistle while he rolled paper, no longer threaded the shop's air. In place of him were traces, a folded map, the faint outline of ink on a fingertip, a scratch at the edge of the workbench where a knife had nicked the varnish. The mapmaker kept these things like bookmarks in a long book he did not yet feel ready to finish. People offered theories as people will. The butcher said the apprentice had gone to seek work on a fishing trawler. The baker said the apprentice had taken up an apprenticeship in a city printing office, the sort that promised more money and less weather. Another version, whispered, careful with its edges, said the apprentice had left because of a disagreement over a map. The mapmaker's insistence on measuring twice and cutting once. The apprentice's impatience with that sort of ritual. For reasons that mattered at the scale of lives and not at all to maps in themselves, the shop took a new temperature. The mapmaker's humming became thinner. The kettle boiled with the same sound, but did not make the room feel the same warmth. Ritual kept the place moving. He made the same cup of tea, not because he required it, but because the cup in its peg was an anchor. He folded maps in exactly the bend he had taught once upon a time, the crease bearing that particular tension he taught his apprentices. Index finger under the paper, thumb on top, the motion completed as if closing a letter to a friend. The shop was a living archive, each crease a catalog entry. The straight edge, carved too long to be useful for anything but maps, sat within reach, its worn edge a ledger of years. When a parcel arrived at the door, the mapmaker would turn it over as if to feel whether it had been handled the right way. He knew, by the softness of a paper, whether a hand that had folded it had been hurried or careful. In the small things he read people as one reads a coastline, in the dips and bulges the small scars. And then, on a Thursday in late autumn, when the light slanted harder and the air held a promise of first frost, a parcel arrived that was not meant for any of the town's habitual trades. It came wrapped in brown paper that had been folded once, creased twice along angles that spoke an intimate language. The label bore a neat hand, and an address he recognized but hadn't seen on a paper parcel for some time. There was no stamp worth noting. Indefinido, if one wanted to pin down postal particulars, but the parcel came not as a town postman, but with a traveler's certainty, placed on the mat as if handed into his keeping. He turned the parcel with the ease of decades, feeling the inner weight shift, hearing the whisper of the paper. He would have sworn the ink pot leaned forward as if to watch. The mapmaker unfastened the twine with a blade that felt like a small, obedient saw. The paper yielded, and within it lay a folded chart whose edges were softened by travel and rain. Someone had drawn a careful line along a river and marked, in the margin, a tiny note. It was not a story. It was not an apology. It was less than that. A small, routine annotation, an instruction, an observation, written in the apprentice's hand. The ink was smudged at the lower corner where a thumb had rested, and the smudge itself formed a peculiar, familiar smudge. A thin streak running parallel to the fold, made as if the thumb had been pressed and then dragged with the exact sedateness he had once taught. The mapmaker's fingers found that smear before his eyes did. He felt the callus on his own thumb. He felt as if remembering the shape of a tune, the way that callus matched distance and pressure. For a moment the shop composed itself around the motion of his hand. The kettle's hiss shrank to something distant. The sunlight held its dust in place like a stage curtain. He did not cry. There was no outward collapse. Instead, there was the simple bodily realignment of a habit resumed. The refolding of the map in the precise manner they had used together. The first, careful placement of the map upon the bench as if to test whether the map still fitted the world he knew. Recognition in that place was never dramatic. It came in the meeting of materials, the ink, the fold, the margin crease, each one saying in its small way, "Remember." The margin note was in the apprentice's slanted hand, the kind one learns from copying another's letters, and at the end of it, tucked between two sentences, was a tiny curl. It was the apprentice's curl, the way a lowercase g, rounded and surged less than the mapmaker's own. The mapmaker felt himself smile without intention, a small, private concession. He lifted the chart and held it between his palms, and, as he did, the stool across from him made a sound, nothing more than the settling noise of the wood, and he, by reflex that had become second nature, went to fetch the kettle. There are many ways to return to a rhythm. Sometimes it is the return of the person who left. Sometimes it is a thing that carries the memory back. In this instance, both arrived at once. A step at the door, one measured and then uncertain. The bell above it gave a tired, small note. He turned, expecting a customer with a question about the coast, and found instead the apprentice standing there, the corners of his coat wet with road, a satchel at his side from which the parcel had likely come. He looked older, not by years so much as by the way the jaw had set, and the hair thinned at the temple. There were lines at his eyes that had not been there before. He carried with him the same nervous, practiced motion of someone who had spent time folding paper in a hurry and had not entirely lost the carefulness he had been taught. They regarded each other for a long breath. There were, between them, things not said, reasons for leaving that had been rescued from the small life of the shop and placed into the large life of the world. The apprentice's hands did not reach for grand explanations. They reached instead for the ink pot, as if to check whether its depth was the same. His thumb brushed its rim and came away with a streak that matched, almost ridiculously, the smear on the map. The mapmaker's tongue felt the sharpness of a memory. He tasted the salt of weather, the faint citrus of cleaning oil, and then he went, without preamble, to close the shutters that let in too much wind. They moved into the old choreography of making a place livable together. The apprentice set the kettle in place and stirred the tea leaf with a spoon whose handle had been nicked by time. The mapmaker, without asking, fetched a rag and wiped the bench where the parcel had lain, smoothing the wood until it shone the way a path in a field might look after the first rain. There was no quick forgiveness. There was no dramatic reunion. There was instead a measured resumption, like two instruments finding their tuning before a concert. When they spoke, it was about small things, about a place on the chart that had shifted, about the way the tide now took the sandbar in a different alignment. Every so often the apprentice would glance down and his hand would find the map he had brought, and he would touch that ink smear with a gentleness that looked like regret, but might have been only habit. The mapmaker's voice stayed low. He asked a question about a marginal note, and the apprentice answered with the precise detail of someone who had been paying attention. Those details stitched the silence like careful thread. Outside, the town registered the change in ordinary ways. Mrs. Harrow from the grocer's paused on the street and left a small loaf on the step. A fisherman, who had watched these two work together for seasons, stopped by the bench to ask for advice on a shoal. Word traveled as it always had, not in a flash of noise but in small visits and observations. The mapmaker found, bit by bit, that the temperature of the shop had changed. Warmer in the practical sense, quieter in the emotional. The apprentice did not sit and explain his absence. He showed, through the care of his hands, how he dampened the rag before brushing a map, the tiny whistled tune he resumed at odd moments, that the time away had not undone the habits of learning. There was work to do. The chart that had come in needed careful restoration where water had weakened the fold. The mapmaker prepared a solution of rabbit glue and water, spreading it with an edge as thin and even as one might thin a memory. He placed the map upon the bench and smoothed its crease with the bone folder they used, the friction slow and deliberate. As he worked, the apprentice stood close enough to pass tools without being asked, the exchange of small objects acting as their conversation. His fingers, when they moved, had the neatness of someone who had been taught to hold a pen, and then had been forced to learn to hold a life differently. There was a humility in that unglamorous labor. To mend is to acknowledge what had been torn, and to accept that the repair will show. The shop, in this period after recognition, took the air of a place where things were made safe again by being touched. The mapmaker taught the apprentice the old way of folding a chart so that the outer corner matched not by measuring but by sight, a trick of the hand that turned up at the seam like a signature. The apprentice showed, in return, a new efficiency in rolling parcels for travelers, how he arranged the maps so the weathered ones were on the inside, protected by the newer folds. There was no competing for mastery. Craft remained shared labor. When a neighbor knocked and asked whether the mapmaker would attend to a boundary that had been argued at the market, the apprentice lifted the same measuring eye and applied the mapmaker's straight edge as if they had never been apart. Recognition had changed nothing and everything. It had not erased the past. It had permitted a different present. They tended to their maps the way one tends to an orchard, pruning here, grafting there, watching which branches bore fruit. Each repair was recorded in the margin with discrete pencil marks. The mapmaker kept one small notebook, a ledger of maps withheld from public sale because they held more memory than cartography. The apprentice, on a quiet afternoon, opened that notebook and found his handwriting in a single entry made some months before he had left. A tiny note about a harbor swell. The presence of that script in the mapmaker's private book was not a reproach. If anything, it was an inheritance, a proof that what one learned in the doing could find its way back even after a long, circuitous route. There were gestures of trust small enough to be mistaken for custom. Once, the mapmaker left town for a morning to address a claim on the far side of the estuary. He left the shop unlocked and told the apprentice, briefly, almost as an aside, to take care. The apprentice made tea, swept the floor with the same pattern the mapmaker had, and rehearsed the opening of the shutters. When the mapmaker returned, the kettle stood empty on the hob, but where he had left it. On the bench lay a chart with a line corrected as he would have done himself. A notch here, a penciled compass there. He did not ask the apprentice why he had done it. There was no need. The map had been made better. Time in that shop did not declare itself in grand moments. It measured itself in afternoons when the light slanted in and the dust found its familiar holes. In mornings when parcels came in the noise of a neighbor's call outside the door. The mapmaker's hands, once uncertain during the months of absence, found again the old patience. They could now teach with the authority of having let go and waited for return. The apprentice, too, had become gentler in his impatience. He held a map as if it might speak if asked politely. He listened to the map seller's regular customers with the deference of someone who had been once a learner and had lived to remain so. On the day they finished the battered chart completely, the glue dried, the tear sewn with the thinnest thread, the margins penciled back into legibility. They spread it upon the bench, and the mapmaker placed his thumb along a river and followed its course. The apprentice did the same, his thumb running a different but complementary route, as if to compare the impressions of their separate histories on the same line. When their thumbs met at a particular bend, both of them paused, and the shop listened as if it, too, knew to hold its breath. There was no pronouncement. Only the atlas of shared work lay before them, its folds and seams the evidence of a journey taken through paper and ink. Outside, the town went on. A child from the school would pop in to ask about the compass rose, and the mapmaker would show her the small magnetic needle he kept for demonstration. An old sailor left a loaf of bread and a piece of cured fish on the step, as a thanks for a chart that had guided him through a night fog. News traveled in the slow succession of these visits, and the shop's reputation remained one of steady craft rather than sudden revival. People preferred it that way. They liked the thought that some places held on to the same warmth because someone there tended to the small things. In the quiet that came on evenings, with shutters closed and a single lamplight left on the bench, the mapmaker would sometimes take out his own old maps and lay them beside the repaired ones. He did not look for dramatic changes. No dramatic resolutions would come from paper, but for the ways a line could tell the truth about who had touched it. The ink pot rested between them like a small churching vessel, its glaze catching the lamplight and reflecting back a map of its own cracks. He put his finger to its rim and felt the familiar warmth, the residue of 100 small marks. The apprentice, nearby, took out his own small notebook and began again to fill it with marginal notes. At the edge of the story there is a modest, final scene. A chart spread wide across the bench, its folds flattened, its ink dry but still carrying the faint scent of glue and the sea. The mapmaker placed his thumb upon a root and traced it, not to prove anything but to remember the work of a life. The apprentice did likewise, their thumbs moving in the same small arc taught by years and repeated practice. Between them sat the ink pot, the carved straight edge leaning in a familiar angle, the bone folder within reach. The shop hummed very softly, a sound composed of breathing and the settling of wood and the distant murmur of the town preparing for night. Craft, in that shop, was a form of stewardship. It was not the grand custodianship of archives with climate control and glass cases. It was the patient, everyday attention that made sure a map remained legible for the person who would need it. Through that attention, the maps accumulated not only geography, but memory. A line on paper might remember hands as surely as it remembered rivers. The shop's work was to receive comings and goings, departures and returns, and to translate them into something enduring. A repaired fold, a penciled margin, a note that would tell someone years hence which shoal to avoid. If you enjoy this kind of quiet story, like and stay with us. They did not remake the past into something tidy. They simply continued to lay one map upon another until the bench held a history measurable by thumbprints and glue stains. The town noticed in the way towns do, in steadier visits, in the way a fisherman now took the apprentice's advice with the same respect he had offered the mapmaker. People did not make a spectacle of it. They found their own small ways to acknowledge what had been repaired. An extra loaf on the step, a lighter load for a parcel. That was enough. When winter came and the light grew thin, the mapmaker and his apprentice sat side by side at the bench with a new chart between them, planning a neat line that would guide a friend north to a harbor not yet marked by the town. They marked it with a pencil first, then with ink, and finally folded it in the same exact bend they had practiced for years. The map was a gentle composite of old knowledge and a new hand. They tied it with twine and set it on the shelf, where it would wait among other charts, not as an end, but as an invitation to travel. In the end, the shop kept its time in small measures, in the inked fingertip, the fold of a map, the settling dust in a shaft of light. These things were not grand enough to be told as legend, yet they were the things that made up lives. A map is at heart a record of attention. The lines do not merely direct a traveler's path, but record the hands that drew them. The old mapmaker's shop remained a place where such hands could meet, repair, and leave traces for those who came after. In a world that often asks for loud declarations, it stood as proof that patient, unglamorous labor quietly holds a community's memory safe. Share this with someone who savors small, steady stories. Subscribe to hear more.